The Panama Canal has always been one of the most important routes in the world. It is a major choke point for trade, and this means that the moment something goes wrong here, the entire world could pretty much be in peril. We saw this play out perfectly back in 2023. The Panama Canal began experiencing delays due to climatic conditions. Because of this, the canal essentially got clogged up for weeks, and trades across the world went stiff. In fact, over the years, the stability and reliability of the Panama Canal have been dropping significantly. And as the world battles unprecedented climate change, many are now looking for alternatives. Alternatives which will completely redistribute the way global trade works, and which could finally make the all-important Panama Canal completely obsolete. In this video, we'll be looking at everything you need to know: the role of the Panama Canal in fostering global trade, the issues that have been plaguing this important trade route, and the impacts of some of the alternatives that could be developed in the near future. For those who might not know, the Panama Canal is one of the most critical maritime choke points in the world. It functions as the most important shipping route in the Western Hemisphere, if not the entire planet. Primarily, the Panama Canal provides a critical link between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, allowing ships to avoid the lengthy and dangerous journey around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. Before the canal was built, ships had to traverse that lengthy route along Cape Horn, making a journey that could last an additional 8,000 nautical miles and prolonging their travel time by as much as 2 months. Thanks to the canal, all travel between the Pacific and Atlantic are now shortened by thousands of nautical miles, with ships being able to just go through the canal and enter their destination. Today, about 40% of all container traffic into the United States passes through the Panama Canal. At the same time, roughly 5% of the world's cargo that moves by sea passes through this canal. The shipping route moves about $270 billion in traffic annually, making it easily one of the nerve centers of the world when it comes to global trade. At the same time, the Panama Canal is also viewed as one of the greatest feats of engineering ingenuity in the history of mankind. Its innovative way of operation makes for fascinating study, and that will come in handy later in this video. For a simplified view of how the Panama Canal works, consider this. When a ship approaches the canal, it enters through one of the canal's gates into the first lock. When the ship is securely situated in the lock, a control operator closes the gates and opens the valves that allow a stream of water to flow into the lock. The rush of water will eventually lift the ship, which itself is kept in the center of the lock with the use of locomotives. The ship enters the second lock, and the same thing happens again, raising it into the third lock and keeping it steady. When the ship finally gets to the third level, which is known as Lake Gatun, it's able to finally continue down the Continental Divide. And when it gets to the end of the lake, it has to be lowered again through the exact same process that elevated it in the first place, just in the reverse order. Besides improving trade, the Panama Canal is also a very important route for several reasons. Primarily, it provides a significant point of access for the United States military, allowing the Navy to redeploy ships quickly enough in times of crisis. When the canal was first built, it was owned exclusively by the United States. Over time, the U.S. government and the Panamanian government decided to both jointly own the canal, sharing their interests and providing common ground for both countries. However, in 2000, control of the Panama Canal was given exclusively to the government of Panama, while the United States continues to hold significant interest in the canal and its operation. Preferential treatment usually gets given to American government and military interests, especially when it concerns access to Asia and its regions. With the Panamanian government now controlling the Panama Canal, it should come as no surprise that they are now free to levy whatever tolls they see fit. In 2021 alone, the Panama Canal made about $4.32 billion for the government of Panama, equating to about 6.5% of the country's entire GDP. With all of this now being understood, it should go without saying that the Panama Canal is incredibly important to the economy of Panama as a country, to the United States military and business interests, and to global trade and maritime transportation in general. So if something should go wrong with it, you can imagine just how wide-ranging the effects would be. Well, between 2023 and right now, the Panama Canal has suffered some serious structural issues which are now threatening its long-term viability and making some of its users question whether it will be able to still keep being functional for them. The first issue that seems to be plaguing the Panama Canal affects how it works itself. You see, the working structure we described earlier is ingenious because it helps ships to overcome the canal's hilly topography. But the problem is that it requires a lot of fresh water to work. When a ship enters into that first lock, the water level within it is raised by the pumping of water from the second lock. But in order to accept the next ship, the extra water in the first lock will need to be emptied out into the ocean. This process pretty much works for both ends of the canal, and the water that is being used mostly comes from two artificially created freshwater reservoirs nearby, Lake Alajuela and Lake Gatun. For each transit around the Panama Canal, about 52 million gallons of fresh water are being consumed and used. And if the reservoirs lose any water, there's not much to worry about since rainfall easily replenishes it all. So as long as rain continues to fall, the water being expelled from the lakes can easily be replenished, allowing the canal to keep working optimally. This brings us to the first problem: drought. You see, Panama is located in a region with relatively high rainfall. The wet season in the country usually lasts from around April until November, while the dry season lasts from about December to March. In 2023, however, a climatic event known as El Niño started disrupting the cycle. The event is pretty regular, occurring about every 7 years, and during this event, the usual trade winds that move from east to west begin to weaken. So warm water is pushed back further to the east, back towards America's west coast, thus preventing deeper, colder water from upwelling towards the surface. From there, this massive patch of water ends up disrupting the usual atmospheric patterns, particularly the winds that usually carry rain into Panama. This entire cycle happened across 2023. The only difference, however, is that the drought that was witnessed last year was much worse than normal. For instance, in October 2023, rainfall was about 41% lower than historical levels. Considering that October is usually the rainiest month of the year for Panama, you can understand how challenging this must have been. All in all, 2023 was a historically dry year for Panama. The country's government reported that the year saw the second lowest levels of rainfall ever recorded in Panama's history. And as you can imagine, the Panama Canal was severely affected. You see, the Panama Canal was built back in the early 20th century, when the global climate was much better and global warming wasn't much of an issue as it is today. As such, the canal was never really designed to operate in an environment where rainfall was so little and could barely replenish the lakes feeding it. To make things worse, we're now firmly in Panama's dry season. So much of the water that was expected to help keep the lakes filled from the wet season has already been depleted. When you consider the fact that the weather is now dry and the Panama Canal is still consuming tens of millions of gallons of water, you can imagine how much of a problem this is. And to top it off, experts now believe that the current El Niño could be one of the longest on record. Typically, El Niño events tend to last about 9 months, but back in September, NOAA reported that the current event had about a 60% chance of lasting through the summer of 2024. If this happens, considering the fact that Panama's wet season will end in November, it's easy to see just how bad things could get. The consequences of this whole structure can't possibly be overstated. For one, we have to consider the fact that the Panama Canal is already significantly depleted due to the drop in water supply. At the same time, the fact that Lake Gatun, the primary source of fresh water to the canal, supplies water to about half of Panama's 42 million people, also means that there is more pressure on the water body across the board. To really understand how dire things are, consider this. A single ship passing through the Panama Canal consumes as much water as 500,000 Panamanians in a single day. Now, compound that by examining the fact that dozens of ships pass through this route on a daily basis. Evidently, the Panamanian government has a serious decision on its hands. How on earth do they manage this flow, and what can be done to restructure things? Will they allocate more of the diminishing water supply to the canal, a significant source of revenue for the country? Or will they prioritize the needs of the people and suffer a significant revenue loss as a result? To balance things, Panama's government has now begun imposing some harsh restrictions on passage through the Panama Canal. Traditionally, about 36 ships are allowed to pass through the Panama Canal on a daily basis. But as the water crisis has gotten worse, that number has steadily been reduced, down to an expected 18 ships per day in February. Besides this, the government is also cracking down on weight access through the Panama Canal. At the moment, 2 ships are allowed to pass through at the same time if they're small enough. Just as well, the government is now restricting the volumes of cargo that ships are allowed to carry through the canal. With lighter loads, ships will dispense lower volumes of water, while also using less water to move through the different locks. All of this is well and good, but the consequences is that cargo volumes are significantly depleted through the Panama Canal. And as you can imagine, all of this has now caused massive trade flow disruptions across the canal and its regions. Ships that had to wait about a day or 2 to pass through the Panama Canal without reservations now have to wait almost 2 weeks. And even with that, the fact that cargo volumes are being cut means that some ships don't even have any hope of passing through at all. For some ships, it's starting to look like taking that route across Cape Horn is looking more like the smarter move. And as the bottlenecks continue to get worse, there's a significant chance that these delays will only keep expanding across the board. These are the longest wait times that ships have ever had to face since the Panama Canal was opened over a century ago. Now, ships that arrive at the canal without reservations have two options. They could pay a bribe to skip the line, meaning that they'd have to drop about $270,000 to move through. Or they could take an alternative, choosing between three possible routes: the Cape of Good Hope, Cape Horn, or the Suez route, all of which are longer and relatively more dangerous. I mean, when you consider the fact that Houthi rebels are currently wreaking havoc around the Suez route, and military forces from both the United States and the United Kingdom are retaliating by dropping bombs in the area, I don't think many shipping companies and cargo operators would want to risk that one. All of this means that shipping companies are in a significant dilemma. They could either fulfill their deliveries much later, or they could pay to skip lines at the Panama Canal and end up passing that cost down to their customers. With all of this being said, it's become pretty clear that the Panama Canal just isn't reliable enough to meet the global demand. And because of that, many are now proposing alternative routes that could essentially help cargo and shipping companies to maintain their seamless operations. The first proposed alternative is the Bi-Oceanic Corridor, a series of paved highways and bridges that extend through Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. If successful, this corridor would make it easier for trucks to move goods coast to coast, as opposed to ships. Because of South America's unique geography, a project like this hasn't been done before, and to be fair, there are several factors that could really affect its completion. From the issues with accessing the continental inland to the existence of things like the Amazon rainforest and the Andes Mountains. Then we have another proposed alternative that's located in Mexico. Essentially, this canal would create a pathway that would link the Atlantic and the Pacific just across Mexico's isthmus of Tehuantepec. The isthmus represents the shortest distance between the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, separating the two oceans by a distance of just about 192 kilometers, about the same length of the Suez Canal. Back in 1907, the Mexican government actually created a railway to transport cargo from one end of the isthmus to the other. But 3 years later, the Mexican Revolution threw the entire country into disarray, while the Panama Canal movement also gained steam. So the railway project fell into ruin. Interestingly, in 2020, the Mexican government announced that it planned to revitalize the old Isthmus Railway project. This new route is what is now known as the Interoceanic Corridor of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. The ports on either side of the isthmus are expected to be upgraded, while a new passenger and cargo freight line will also be launched to ferry both people and goods along. All in all, the Mexican government is committing about $2.85 billion to the project, and it is expected to be completed in the early 2030s. Finally, there's also a plan to build a replacement canal around Nicaragua. For this one, the plans have actually been ongoing for centuries now. In theory, Nicaragua has a unique geography that lends itself to the feasibility of a transport canal, primarily because of the presence of Lake Nicaragua. To the west of the lake, you have a narrow isthmus that's about 19 kilometers wide, and to its east, you have another isthmus that's about 100 kilometers wide. So it would only take creating a canal that measures about 120 kilometers to form another link between the Atlantic and Pacific. Interestingly, the United States government had actually been more interested in creating a canal in Nicaragua before settling for Panama. But after the Panama Canal was created, the Nicaragua project pretty much became redundant, only to be revived around 2012. That year, the Nicaraguan government authorized the creation of a state-backed canal authority. Then, in 2013, the government awarded the building project to a Hong Kong-based company called HKND. Led by a billionaire industrialist, HKND began sourcing for about $50 billion, which they believe the Nicaraguan project would cost. If it had been completed, the project was anticipated to double Nicaragua's GDP. But at the same time, it could have also granted control of a Panama Canal rival to the Chinese government. As you can imagine, Washington would have thrown a massive tantrum over this. Fortunately, the Nicaraguan project never really got off the ground. Environmental feasibility studies suggested that it would have significantly damaged the ecology around Lake Nicaragua, and local farmers also went up in protest against it. All of this, as well as the fact that rampant corruption was a hallmark of Nicaragua's government, and HKND CEO also lost most of his fortune after China's stock market crashed in the mid-2010s, led to the project being pretty much abandoned. The Panama Canal has always been a nerve center in global commerce and shipping. But with current geological and climate challenges, there's a sense that the canal might be losing its monopoly. But what do you think? Which of these potential alternatives could possibly replace the canal? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more insightful content.